Greetings. Chag Sameach. Happy festival to you. Shavua Tov. Good week to you. This is the first day of the week. But during this special 7-day period of unleavened bread, this festival time, this appointed time, we are on the 4th day of unleavened bread. And this year, we are on, let's say, the way we call days in English, we call the first day of the week Sunday. So as far as the days of the week, this is the unleavened Sunday. And that is very important because it is the unleavened Sunday which begins the count towards Pentecost. And there's a lot of significance to that, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. I want to talk today about the Passover season, emotion and logic. I want to talk today about the Passover season, emotion and logic. First of all, New Testament Christians ought to be keeping this special season, beginning with the Passover. And the Jews refer to the whole holiday that way as Passover. And more technically, there's the Passover sacrifice and then the festival of unleavened bread. And the Passover is eaten to begin the festival. The lamb was in ancient times eaten to begin the festival. And New Testament Christians ought to be keeping this festival. And you would get that impression from 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. I realize there's different ways to interpret it, but let's just read it. And what impression would you get from reading it? This is 1 Corinthians 5:6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I want to go now to Acts 20. And here we see the Apostle Paul. His exploits are written about here by his physician, Luke. And how does Luke talk about the time? What markers does he use? Acts 20, verse 6. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now, during the festival of unleavened bread, there was a particular day when a special offering was brought to the temple, and that was connected to another offering that was going to be brought 7 weeks later. And it was also brought during a festival. So one offering was brought during this festival, and then another offering was brought analogous in some ways to the at the time of the festival 7 weeks later. I want to go into that today. This is the day, ladies and gentlemen, those who are listening, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, whoever's listening, this is the day that Jesus Christ ascended to his Father. Now, not necessarily, I'm not talking about the date. I mean that within the days of unleavened bread, it was on what we would call a Sunday. It was on the Sunday that was unleavened. During the days of unleavened bread is when Jesus Christ ascended to heaven, and we'll understand the symbolism of that in just a moment. I want to go to Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23. But actually, before I do that, when I go to Leviticus 23, I'm talking about logic. And first, I want to talk a little about emotion. As I said, this talk is about the Passover season, emotion, and logic. I want to begin with emotion. Yesterday, the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread, was the day when the festival scroll would be read publicly, the festival scroll of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, or Canticles, or Song of Solomon. And obviously, it talks about how married couples ought to behave. And it also is analogous to the relationship of God to Israel, of Jesus Christ and the church. And this is the season of the year when God wooed his bride, Israel, when he did so many wonderful things for them so that they would want to marry him, which they did at Sinai. And he commends them for following him. And marching down the aisle, you could say, with him. In Jeremiah 2, I want to go to Jeremiah 2. Moreover, the word of the Eternal came to me, saying, Go and cry in the hearing of Jerusalem, saying, Thus says the Eternal, I remember you, the kindness of your youth, the love of your betrothal, when you went after me in the wilderness, and a land not sown. So we were willing to follow him into the wilderness and marry him at Mount Sinai. So it talks about that, and it talks, of course, about, from a New Testament perspective, Jesus Christ and the church. It also is simply talking about husbands and wives. This is the spring of the year. This is the time, of new life, and a time to rejuvenate our relationships as a husband and wife. And I want to go to Song of Solomon. This time of the year is generally when the rainfall begins to subside, and so people can go out and enjoy nature together. And in Song of Solomon 2 and verse 8, the voice of my beloved, behold, he comes, leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. Well, let me. There's a lot here. Let me just jump to verse 10. My beloved spoke and said to me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, and the voice of singing has come. The time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grapes give a good smell. Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. That reminds me of the old King James translation. I don't have one in front of me, but I think instead of saying turtle dove, they just used the word turtle there. And Mark Twain, evidently, being a humorist and a cynic, evidently when he was in the land of Israel, the region called Palestine in the 19th century, and he toured the area, and evidently he was there at the springtime, and he said he never heard a single turtle. Well, turtles you don't hear turtles. It's a turtle dove. But one time I mentioned that quip of Mark Twain, and somebody came up to me after the Bible study and said, turtles do make a sound. Well, maybe they do. But anyway, this is a turtle dove. So in any case, this is a romantic poem. And this is the time of year when it comes, particularly comes to mind. And in the 4th chapter, in the 7th verse, what does the husband say to the wife? He says to her, You are all fair, my love, and there is no spot in you. So I hope that's the frame of mind you husbands have towards your wife, that when you look at your wife, that's what you see. You are all fair, my love, and there is no spot in you. And this goes to Ephesians, the 5th chapter, and what the Apostle Paul says about marriage. He gives a lot of instructions there about the relationship of husbands and wives, which ought to be, of course, heeded. But then he says it's an analogy of Christ and the church. And he says in Ephesians 5:25, Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, as I just read in Song of Solomon 4:7. That he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. And he continues on in that frame, and finally he says, verse 32, after giving very powerful instruction to husbands and wives, he goes to verse 32 and says, "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." So he says husbands and wives ought to do what I told you, but remember, it's also, there's a spiritual analogy there. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So this is a time, of course, for married couples to rekindle the romance, as it were. Maybe you've been very busy and I'm preoccupied, maybe getting ready for the festival, de-leavening and all that. Well, that's behind us now. We're de-leavened. Besides, under the present circumstances, we're practically in house arrest in much of the world. So it gives married couples a chance to, have quality time with one another. So that's, you could say, the emotional side of this season of the year. It's a time for married couples to, as I said, to rekindle the romance, to use an American term. Now, of course, for those who are single, the Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes, for those who are single, there's a time to embrace and there's a time to refrain from embracing. All right. I want to go on now and talk about logic. Now that I've talked about emotion, I want to talk about logic. So I'll put on now my maybe I'll get my pointed ears as a Vulcan. Live long and prosper. You know where that came from. That came from the priestly benediction that we priests recite. We hold our hands in a certain way when we do it. And so Leonard Nimoy peeked and saw the priest doing that. And when he was a little boy, you're not supposed to look at the priests when they do it, but he peeked, and so he saw them doing that, and got the idea: live long and prosper. But let's go back to logic. I want to go logically to Leviticus. Let's be logical in Leviticus, and let's go to Leviticus 23. And here we see Moadim, appointed times. And they're called feasts in my translation. I'm using the New King James. You might be using another one. But it says Moadim, and somehow the New King James translates that as feasts. It means appointed times. Anyway, and the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Eternal which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. These are my feasts." So there are times to under normal circumstances to come together to celebrate the feast with others. They're holy convocations. Nowadays, we're doing it generally electronically. Now, what's the first one talked about? The weekly Sabbath. That's the first one talked about. This is important from a logical point of view, all right? We're using logic now. 6 days shall work be done, and the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Eternal in all your dwellings. All right? That's the first day that's defined, the Sabbath. And now we go to annual feasts. These are the feasts of the Eternal, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Eternal's Passover. So this is the first step in the holy days. You first sacrifice the lamb, and you do it at the end of the 14th, and you go eat it on the 15th to begin the festival. You have to eat it with unleavened bread. That's the night to be much observed. But first you kill the Passover. Now that's the next date that is defined. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Eternal's Passover. So now the Passover is defined. And that leads into then the festival season of unleavened bread. So the next day is a holy day. After the 14th comes the holy day. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Eternal. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. And I believe the term here should be Chag HaMatzot. I actually have a Hebrew Bible in front of me, and I'll turn there. But when we talk about the festival of unleavened bread in Hebrew, we usually call it Chag HaMatzot. So I want to go to Leviticus 23, and just make sure that that's the term that's used. Okay, Leviticus 23. I have a Hebrew Bible here, and it's right, Chag HaMatzot. All right, so what is a Chag? This is not, this is C-H-A-G, or H with a dot under it, A-G. Right? What is a Chag? Well, there's two words connected to Chag. One has to do with a circle, with getting in a circle. In other words, interacting with people, folk dancing, or conversing in a social circle. In other words, being celebrating together with people. That's one meaning of Chag. Another, if you remember, what do Muslims do when they go to Mecca? The Hajj, the pilgrimage. So a Chag would represent pilgrimage. So a holy day, a festival season, is a time to go somewhere and to be with others, of like mind and of like beliefs and practices, and to commemorate the day. And I realize right now we have to do that in a different way than normally because of health issues. I understand that. But anyway, this is the festival of unleavened bread, and it comes right after the Passover. And notice that in the middle of that festival, something is going to happen. And it's going to happen on, I'll explain to you, it's going to happen on the unleavened Sunday, what we would call Sunday in English, Yom Rishon. In Hebrew, it's called Yom Rishon, the first day. And also, by the way, Portuguese follows that pattern for the rest of the week. Pardon me. If some of you speak Portuguese, you'll know that Monday is the second day, and Tuesday, I believe, is the third day, and so forth until the sixth day, just as in Hebrew, although you have a different word for Sunday than we have in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's Yom Rishon, the first day. Anyway, to get back into English, verse 9. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you have come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. So you have to bring a measure of the first fruits of the harvest. Now the grain harvest begins with barley. So this is the beginning of the barley harvest, and you bring a certain measure of grain. This is called an Omer, and when you bring it, and then you have to lift it up, and you wave it. So you lift it up and you wave it. It's a wave offering. They call it here the wave sheaf in this Bible. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. All right, so it has to be. When do you do this? This is not yet defined. Obviously, it's at the time that you harvest it, but what specific day do you do it? Verse 11, He shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Well, now, what have we been talking about up till now? First, we defined the Sabbath. Then we defined the Passover. And then we went to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So obviously it's during the Feast of Unleavened Bread that we should do this, because the next offering of this type is offered during the next festival, which this day begins a count to the next festival when you have another special offering, the first fruits of the wheat harvest. But when does the season begin? It obviously begins on the 14th. You can't... In the old day, in ancient times, you couldn't keep the festival without the sacrifice of the Passover. You would sacrifice the Passover lamb, and then you had to eat it to begin the festival. So the 14th is critical. In fact, the Passover sacrifice is so important, they were commanded to do it in Exodus 12 before they ever left Egypt. And it's so important that we still do it, even under the New Covenant, in a different way. Instead of killing a lamb, we eat unleavened bread and wine as a symbol of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. We do it on the 14th, but we don't do it at the end of the 14th. We do it at the beginning. That's when he said to do it for various reasons, which I've gone into at other times. But we do it on the 14th. So what I'm telling you is this. The 14th day of the first month begins this holy day cycle, and it immediately goes into the festival of unleavened bread. So during that time, on the day after the Sabbath, we should waive it. Well, we know what day the Sabbath is. That's defined in the beginning. We have the Sabbath, 6 days, and the seventh day is the Sabbath. So during unleavened bread, there's going to be a Sabbath, and the day after that is going to be what we call in English Sunday. So on the unleavened Sunday, you offer that Omer. You pick it up, the first fruits of the grain, the barley. You lift it up. You wave it. And then you begin counting towards the next festival, when you're going to bring the first fruits of the next harvest, which is the wheat harvest. Now, see, it works perfectly if the 14th day of the first month is on a Sabbath. You know that when the Sabbath is the 8th day of a boy's life, you circumcise the boy on the Sabbath. If you're an Israelite, he's circumcised on the 8th day. If it's a Sabbath, you go ahead and do it. And it's the same thing with the Passover. The Passover is on the 14th day of the first month. You go ahead and offer the sacrifice. That means the first day of unleavened bread is a Sunday. And then you have a beautiful analogy. Right on the holy day, you offer the Omer. And then on the next, on the holy day of the next festival, Pentecost, then you offer the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Now, most years it doesn't work exactly that way. But most years you are going to offer the grain offering during the days of unleavened bread. So it will be offered during a festival. And the next offering will be offered during a festival as well. That festival is a holy day. It's only a one-day festival, and it's a holy day, but it connects to a Sabbath right before. So really you have 2 days of rest there, one of which is the annual holy day. So the analogy is there. And so you begin counting then, and this day then we begin counting towards Pentecost this year. So I want to go on to verse 15. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, which I already explained, the unleavened Sunday that comes after the 14th day of the first month. It comes during the days of unleavened bread. It might be the first day. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. And then the next day after 7 Sabbaths will be a Sunday. That will be the 8th Sunday, and that will be the next festival, Shavuot, the festival of weeks. You've counted 7 weeks. This is the 50th day. It evidently had the name Chag Chamishim Yom, the festival of 50 days, which is what it's called in the Greek. Pentecost in the American version of the Greek word, meaning 50th day. And so it's the 50th day, Pentecost. And so in verse 16, count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. Oh, so this is now the first fruit of the wheat harvest. And you shall bring forth from your dwelling 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits to the Eternal. So these are also waved, by the way, if you keep reading. I'm going to go to verse 20. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits. What other things that are mentioned you could read. As a wave offering before the Eternal with the 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Eternal for the priest. So you also waved these loaves of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. So let's understand the typology, which most of you already know, but the typology as we understand, the barley, the first fruits of the barley harvest offered during the days of unleavened bread, the wave sheaf as it's called, is the risen Christ. He ascended to his Father on the Sunday during the days of unleavened bread in the year that he was crucified. That Sunday, as they were offering the wave sheaf, he was resurrected. or he was rather ascended to his dad. He was already alive, but I mean that morning he ascended, he ascended to his Father, and so he was the antitype of the wave sheaf. Now the first fruits of the wheat harvest, they represent the resurrected saints. Perhaps the resurrection will occur around Pentecost. I'm not saying it will happen on Pentecost necessarily, but it could happen around that time of the year. We don't know when it's going to happen, but anyway, around that season is very likely when it happens. But the wave, the first fruits of the wheat harvest, those 2 loaves represent the resurrected saints. Pardon me. Why 2 loaves? It may be, those who were saints before the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and those who were saints after, or perhaps those saints who are not alive when Christ returns, and those who are. Both of them are going to be involved in the resurrection of the saints. They are the first fruits of humanity. So let's now go to 1 Corinthians 15. And in 1 Corinthians 15, around verse 23, I'll go to verse 22. 1 Corinthians 15:22. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits. That's what would be happening today as a sacrifice. The Omer would have been offered. And so that was symbolic of Jesus Christ ascending to his Father. But each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits. Afterward, those who are Christ that is coming. Oh, and they are the first fruits of the wheat harvest, which comes 7 weeks from today. In ancient times, it would have happened. And I want to go to James 1:18 for that. James 1 and verse 18. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So are we okay about all this? We have the unleavened Sunday when they offered the first fruits of the barley harvest, the Omer, and then we count toward to Pentecost, and then Pentecost they offer the first fruits of the wheat harvest, the loaves that were baked with leaven, which is interesting. That might indicate the fact that even though we are saints, we're all sinners as well. It also may indicate the fact of, if you look at Matthew 13 and the related verses, that the kingdom of God is like leaven. It begins small and then fills the whole earth, as we know. I want to go to John 20, and here we find the resurrected Christ. He's already resurrected. It's Sunday morning, and he's already resurrected, but he hasn't ascended yet, because see they cut the grain on Saturday night, but they waited till daylight to offer the offering. So it was offered on Sunday morning, and so and now we're Sunday morning. During that first century, during that time, during the week of his arrest and crucifixion and resurrection. So he's alive, and it's Sunday morning during the days of unleavened bread. And I want to go to verse 16 when she recognizes him. So dramatic. I could read a lot more, but speaking now, that's getting back to emotion again. See, but here I was trying to be logical, trying to explain logically when to begin counting. I want to be nifty counting 50. I want to do it right. We want to do it right. Let me explain what I mean by that. I know I'm in John, but I'm going to jump to Acts for just a moment. Not that far ahead, Acts 2. So, you're almost there. So I want to go to Acts 2 and verse 1. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. So it's not the evening that begins the festival, but it's when it had fully come. It's daylight, and everybody is together at the temple, and they're ready to do the rituals for Pentecost, which would involve the first fruits of the wheat harvest. They're all there, and that's the birthday of the church. That's where things really get exciting. If you keep reading Acts 2, that's where the church gets its jump start. Pentecost of 31 AD. Obviously, you want to be there at the right time. So that's why I'm saying, be nifty counting 50. So anyway, to get back to John 20, in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, or which is to say, teacher, my master, my teacher. And what did she want to do? What would you want to do? You'd want to grab him. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. I can't hang around here. I'm glad you saw me, but I'm going to now ascend. So he was telling her, in effect, I'm the antitype of the Omer they're offering at the temple. They're waving the offering, and I'm going to wave bye-bye to you and head heavenly. Verse 17, Jesus said, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Why did he speak like that? Because here the resurrected man is speaking. So God became, let's say, God the Son became the Son of God. There's a lot of theology in that statement. But anyway, so here we have Jesus Christ, the resurrected man, saying that I'm ascending up to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Now, as I said, there's a lot of theology in there, but that's what's going on here. Jesus Christ, as a man, was killed, suffered, and was killed, and as a man was resurrected to immortal life. And I read, I think it was yesterday morning, an important verse in 1 Timothy, and I'm going to read that now, because it's important to keep in mind Jesus Christ was both human and divine, and the man died, and the man was resurrected, and the man, therefore, can intercede for us. And so I go to 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5, and some of you may have heard me read it yesterday, but here it says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. All right, now I want to go from here and, as I said, review what I covered today. This is a time of renewal of the love of husband and wife. It's the time of renewal for the love of Christ and the church towards Jesus Christ. He doesn't need to have his love renewed, but we periodically need to have our love renewed. Remember what God says what Jesus Christ says to the church at Ephesus. You've left your first love. Get back. Get back. So we have to keep that enthusiasm going, both in our marriages and then in the relationship of the church to Christ. That's the emotional side. But the logical side is, let's remember that there are instructions in the Bible as to how to count Pentecost, when to offer the wave sheaf, and when to start counting towards Pentecost, so that we do it according to the biblical instructions. And so that's why I wanted to get into that. That's a matter of objectively reading the material, putting all the data together. And I haven't done all of that today, but I gave you at least a basic introduction to all of that. Now, earlier I read in 1 Corinthians 15, and that is something that we should keep in mind when we come to the Sunday during the days of unleavened bread, and we realize, well, that was the time that the wave sheaf was offered, and that was the time when Jesus Christ ascended to his Father. Then we ought to keep in mind that the resurrection of Jesus Christ means, that we can also look forward, if we are Christ's, if we belong to him, we can also look forward to our resurrection. And so I can conclude with that in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 57. Jesus Christ, of course, was victorious. He did what he had to do,
and received the reward to which he was entitled. And that ought to be the same for us. We need to do what we have to do so that we can receive the reward to which we will then be entitled, according to God's will. 1 Corinthians 15:57. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. All the best to you and yours.